Rain hit the pavement so hard it sounded like static, and Maya Coleman was already running before she understood why she was running. Her shoes were soaked through, her breath tore at her chest, and behind her, somewhere in the dark, a pair of headlights had been crawling along the curb for the last 6 blocks, matching her pace exactly whenever she slowed down. She turned a corner sharply, cutting between 2 parked delivery vans, and pressed her back against cold brick. Her heart slammed so loud she was sure it could be heard over the storm. She counted to 10. The headlights did not follow. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe she had not. She had left her father's house with nothing but a backpack, $23, and a phone with 11% battery. That had been 4 hours ago. Since then, she had walked in circles, afraid to call anyone, afraid that calling anyone would somehow lead back to him, to the shouting, to the way his voice had cracked the walls of that house without him ever raising a hand. Words could do that. She knew that better than most people her age. She peered around the edge of the van. The street was empty except for rain bouncing off asphalt, and a single lit window 3 blocks down, glowing amber against the black night. A diner sign, half its letters burned out, spelled out something close to Art's Place. It was the only light on the whole street. Maya did not think. She just moved toward it, because moving toward light felt safer than standing still in the dark, waiting for headlights to come back. The bell above the door gave a small, tired chime as she pushed inside, dripping onto the tile floor. The diner was nearly empty. A radio behind the counter played something soft and forgettable. A man was wiping down the counter with the unhurried rhythm of someone closing up for the night, not expecting anyone else to walk in. He looked up. He was maybe 30, dark hair damp at the collar from steam off the grill, sleeves rolled to his elbows. His expression did not do the thing most people's faces did when they saw someone show up soaked and shaking at 11 at night. He did not look alarmed, or suspicious, or annoyed at the mess she was about to make on his floor. He just looked, the way you look at weather, taking in the fact of her without judgment attached. "We're closing in 20 minutes, he said, not unkindly. Then he seemed to actually see her face, the way her eyes kept darting back toward the door, the way her hands would not stop shaking even though the diner was warm. He set the rag down. "You want to sit? I can get you something hot before I lock up." Maya hesitated at the threshold, one hand still on the door, as if she needed an exit mapped before she could let herself relax even an inch. "I'm fine," she said, which was such an obvious lie that even she almost laughed at herself for saying it. "Sure," he said, letting it go. "Booth by the window's warm, heater's right under it. Coffee's on me either way, whether you sit or not." There was something in the plainness of the offer that undid a knot in her chest she hadn't realized was there. Nobody had offered her anything all night without wanting something back. She slid into the booth, boots squeaking on vinyl, and pulled her wet backpack onto her lap like a shield. He brought the coffee over himself, along with a folded towel from behind the counter, and set both down without ceremony. "Name's Daniel," he said. "I own this place, for better or worse. Mostly worse. Some nights." A small smile, there and gone. "Maya," she said, before she could decide whether giving her real name was wise. "You want to tell me why you were standing outside in weather like this, instead of anywhere with a roof?" Daniel asked, but he asked it the way you'd ask about the weather itself. No pressure behind it, no demand that she answer. She wrapped both hands around the mug instead of answering. Steam curled up past her face. Outside, the rain had not let up, and somewhere out there, she kept thinking, was a set of headlights that might or might not have been following her, might or might not belong to someone she used to trust more than anyone else in the world. "Family stuff," she finally said. "I just needed somewhere to think." Daniel nodded slowly, like that answer was complete enough for him, at least for tonight. "Fair enough. You don't owe me the whole story." He glanced at the clock above the pass-through window, then back at her. "Thing is, I do need to lock the front door in about 15 minutes. If you've got somewhere to go, that's your business. If you don't, I've got a back office with a couch that's seen better decades, but it's dry, and the door locks from the inside if that matters to you." Maya looked at him carefully then, really looked, trying to read what was underneath the offer. She had grown up with a father who never gave anything away for free, who kept score of every favor like currency to be collected later with interest. The idea that a stranger might simply offer safety without a hidden cost felt almost impossible to trust. Why would you do that? She asked. You don't know me. Daniel considered the question honestly, instead of brushing it off. My mother spent 2 winters without a stable place to sleep. Back when I was a kid, people helped her sometimes, and sometimes they didn't, and I remember exactly which nights were which, even now. I'm not saying I'm some kind of hero for offering a couch. I'm saying I know what the alternative looks like, and I'd rather not be the guy who didn't.
Something about the simplicity of that answer, the fact that it wasn't dressed up in anything, made her chest loosen another fraction.
She looked down at the coffee, at the little rings of steam rising and disappearing. I don't want to be any trouble, she said quietly. You're not, Daniel said. You're a person who got caught in the rain. Happens to everybody eventually. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far off, and for a second the diner window rattled gently in its frame. Maya flinched at the sound, small and quick, and Daniel noticed it, filing it away without comment, the way you notice a crack in a wall you plan to fix later. He gave her 20 minutes to finish the coffee and dry off before he led her through the swinging door behind the counter, into a narrow hallway that smelled like old coffee grounds and cardboard, and then into a small office crowded with a battered desk, filing cabinets, and, against the far wall, a couch that had clearly hosted more than a few late nights of paperwork and exhausted naps. Bathrooms down the hall. There's a lock on that door too if it makes you feel better, Daniel said, handing her a spare blanket from the cabinet. I'll be up front finishing the clothes for another half hour, then I'm heading home. I'll leave my number on the counter in case you need anything, and I'll be back to open at 6. You're welcome to stay till then, or longer if you need it. No questions unless you want to answer them. Maya sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, the blanket bundled in her lap, and for the first time in hours, she let her shoulders drop from around her ears. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than the 2 small words could carry. Don't mention it, Daniel said, and meant that too. He paused at the doorway. For what it's worth, whatever happened tonight, it doesn't have to define what happens tomorrow. Sleep if you can. He pulled the door until it was almost closed, leaving a thin line of hallway light spilling in, the kind of gesture that told her he understood, without her having to say it, that a fully dark, fully closed room might feel too much like a trap tonight. Maya lay down on the couch, still in her damp clothes, and stared at the ceiling tiles, listening to the rain finally beginning to soften against the roof. Somewhere out there, her father was probably sitting in the dark of their living room, replaying the argument in his head the way he always did, deciding he had been right, deciding she would come crawling back once she ran out of money and pride. She thought of the headlights that had trailed her for 6 blocks, and wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes, whether he already knew exactly where she had ended up. She did not know that 4 days from now, that same question would no longer be a matter of wondering. For now, in the quiet of a stranger's office, with the smell of old coffee, and the distant hush of rain finally slowing to a drizzle, Maya Coleman closed her eyes for the first time, in what felt like a very long time, and let herself, just for a few hours, stop running. She woke before dawn to the sound of the back door opening, her whole body going rigid before her mind caught up and recognized the voice that followed, low and unhurried, calling out to let her know it was only Daniel, back early to start the grill. She sat up on the couch, blanket sliding off her shoulders, and for a moment she forgot where she was, forgot the rain, forgot the headlights, forgot everything, except the strange, unfamiliar feeling of having slept through an entire night, without waking every hour to check the door. She found him in the kitchen, cracking eggs onto a flat-top grill with the kind of practiced motion that came from years of repetition. He glanced up when she appeared in the doorway, hair messy, eyes still heavy with sleep, and did not comment on how rough she looked, which she appreciated more than she could say. There's coffee, he said simply, and I'm making more eggs than I need, so you might as well eat something before you decide what you're doing today. Maya lingered in the doorway a moment longer, watching him work, trying to decide if this kindness had an expiration date she hadn't found yet. Back home, kindness always seemed to come with strings attached, favors expected in return, gratitude measured and weighed. Here, in this small kitchen smelling of butter and coffee grounds, nobody seemed to be keeping score. You really don't want anything from me, she said, half question, half disbelief, as she took the plate he slid across the counter. I want you to eat before it gets cold, Daniel said, deadpan enough that it took her a second to realize he was joking, which surprised a small, unexpected laugh out of her, the first real one in longer than she cared to admit. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten from black to a bruised, uncertain gray, the kind of color that came right before a city decided whether the day would be kind or not. Maya ate slowly, aware of every bite, aware of the strange gift of a quiet morning, after a night she had genuinely feared might not end well. She still had no plan beyond this moment, no idea where she would sleep tomorrow or the day after, but for the first time since slamming that front door behind her, she felt something close to steady ground beneath her feet. She did not yet know how many more mornings she would spend in this kitchen before everything came rushing back to find her. 3 days passed, and Maya kept returning to the diner the way a compass needle keeps returning north, not because she had decided to, but because something in her simply pulled that direction whenever the day grew long and the streets grew unfamiliar. On the first morning she had told herself she would find her own place by nightfall, maybe a shelter, maybe a cheap room, anything that did not depend on the charity of a man she had known for less than 24 hours. By the second night, still without anywhere better to go, she had swallowed her pride and asked Daniel if she could sleep on the office couch one more time. He had said yes before she finished the sentence. By the third day, he had started giving her small jobs around the diner, nothing that felt like charity dressed up as work, but real tasks that needed doing. Wiping down booths after the morning rush, restocking napkin dispensers. Once, when the dishwasher broke down and the sink backed up with a mountain of plates, she rolled up her sleeves without being asked and worked beside him until closing, both of them soaked to the elbows and laughing despite the mess, the kind of laughter that comes from shared exhaustion rather than anything particularly funny. "You're better at this than half the people I've actually hired," Daniel told her that night, sliding $2 from the tip jar across the counter, along with a plate of the day's leftover pie. "I can't pay you properly, not off the books, but I can feed you and cover your shifts here until you figure out your next move." "Deal?" "Deal," Maya said, and meant it with a gratitude that embarrassed her slightly, because $2 and a slice of pie should not have felt like the best offer she had received in months, and yet here she was, feeling exactly that. It was during the slow hours of the fourth afternoon, the diner nearly empty between lunch and dinner, that Daniel finally asked the question he had been carefully avoiding since the night of the storm. He was refilling the sugar dispensers at the counter, while Maya sat on a stool nearby, peeling the paper off a straw with more focus than the task really required. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said, keeping his eyes on the sugar rather than her face, giving her room to answer, or not answer, without feeling cornered. "But if you ever want to talk about your family, about what happened that night, I'm not going anywhere. I'm just saying the offer's open." Maya was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Daniel thought she might simply let the silence answer for her. Then she set the straw down and folded her hands together, the way she used to do as a child whenever she was steadying herself to speak about something difficult. "My father is not a violent man," she began carefully, as though the words had been rehearsed many times in her head before ever reaching her mouth. "He's never once raised a hand to me, not in my whole life, and I need you to understand that, because it's important, but he has this way of talking, this way of making you feel small, with just his voice, just the right words in the right order, until you start to believe every single thing he says about you must be true." Daniel set down the sugar dispenser and gave her his full attention, leaning against the counter, saying nothing, letting the space belong entirely to her. "He raised me alone after my mother passed when I was 6, Maya continued. "He worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and I know, somewhere underneath everything, that he loves me. But somewhere along the way, loving me and controlling me became the same thing in his mind. Every decision I made, he had already decided was wrong before I finished explaining it. The college I wanted to attend, the job I eventually took instead, the friends he approved of and the ones he didn't, even, eventually, the man I was seeing before we broke things off 6 months ago, because my father made every single dinner with him feel like an interrogation." She paused, staring down at her hands. "The night I came here, we had a fight about my job. I told him I was thinking about moving out, getting my own apartment across town, closer to work. He didn't yell, not really. He never yells, but he said things that felt worse than yelling. He said I was ungrateful, He said I was throwing away everything he had sacrificed for me. He said if I walked out that door, I shouldn't bother coming back until I was ready to admit I was wrong. So you walked out the door, Daniel said quietly. I walked out the door, Maya confirmed, and I've been too proud and too scared to call him since, because some part of me is convinced that if I call, I'll hear that same tone in his voice, and I'll cave, and I'll go back to being exactly who he wants me to be, instead of who I'm trying to become. Daniel considered his words carefully before speaking, aware that whatever he said next might matter more than he could fully anticipate. For what it's worth, wanting your own life doesn't make you ungrateful, it makes you a person. But I also think, and you can tell me to mind my own business here, that there's a difference between going back to him and simply letting him know you're safe. He might not deserve your forgiveness yet, that's not mine to decide, but not knowing whether his daughter is safe somewhere out in the world, that's a particular kind of fear I wouldn't wish on anyone, even someone who said things he shouldn't have. Maya looked up at him, surprised by the fairness of the observation, the way he managed to hold space for her pain, without simply validating every grievance she carried, without dismissing it either. You're very calm about all of this, she said. Most people either tell me to go straight home and apologize, or tell me to never speak to him again. You're doing neither. I don't know your father, Daniel said simply. I only know you, and only for a few days at that. I'm not in a position to tell you what to do about him. I just know what it felt like, watching my mother go without people checking on her. And I know that whatever's happening between you and your father, somebody out there is probably lying awake wondering if you're okay, whether that somebody deserves the worry or not. That night, after closing, Maya sat alone in the office with her phone in her hand, the battery finally charged after Daniel had lent her a cable days earlier, staring at her father's contact photo, an old picture from 3 birthdays ago where he was almost smiling. She did not call. She was not ready for that yet, but she typed out 4 words in a text message, deleted them, typed them again, and finally, with her thumb hovering for a long moment over the send button, let it go. I am safe. Please don't worry. She did not send her location. She did not explain where she was staying or with whom. She told herself this was enough. A small olive branch extended without surrendering any ground, a way to ease one worry without inviting the argument to continue. What she did not know, could not have known, was that her father had already spent 3 sleepless nights doing something far more determined than simply worrying. He had gone to her workplace and learned she hadn't shown up. He had called every friend whose number he still had saved from years earlier. And on the second night, unable to sleep, unable to sit still in a house that felt unbearably quiet without her, he had gotten into his car and begun driving through the neighborhoods she used to frequent, searching every lit window for some sign of his daughter, the very same headlights that had trailed behind her in the rain on the night she first found her way to Daniel's diner. He was closer than she thought, and he was not going to stop looking. 2 days after Maya sent that brief, guarded text message, her father, Victor Coleman, sat in his car outside a small grocery store 2 blocks from the diner, staring at his phone, rereading her 4 words for what must have been the 100th time. Relief and frustration warred inside him in equal measure. Relief that she was alive and unharmed, frustration that she still refused to tell him where she was, as if he were some stranger to be kept at arm's length rather than the man who had raised her single-handedly through every fever, every heartbreak, every ordinary Tuesday of her entire childhood. He had never considered himself an unreasonable man. In his own mind, every rule he had ever set, every argument he had ever pressed, had been in service of protecting her from a world that had already taken her mother far too soon, a world he did not trust to handle something as precious as his only child with proper care. It had never once occurred to him that the same protectiveness he wore as evidence of his love might, from where Maya stood, look and feel like something closer to a cage. He noticed, almost by accident, the diner sign glowing at the end of the block, half its letters burned out, and something in the back of his mind snagged on it, a memory of Maya once mentioning she liked the coffee at a small place near her old apartment, back before everything between them had grown so complicated. He did not know for certain it was the same place. He only knew that his search had led him, block by careful block, closer and closer to this particular street, and that some instinct, sharpened by days of worry, told him he was finally close to an answer. He started the car and pulled forward, slow enough to read every storefront, his eyes scanning each window for any sign of his daughter's familiar silhouette. Earlier that same afternoon, before Victor ever turned onto that street, Maya had spent an unusually quiet hour sitting in a corner booth with Daniel during the lull between lunch and dinner, the two of them sorting through a shoebox of old receipts that needed organizing for the diner's taxes. It was mindless work, the kind that let conversation wander freely, without either person having to think too hard about where it might lead. "Can I ask you something?" Maya said, sliding a stack of faded paper across the table. "And you don't have to answer if it's too personal." "Turnabout is fair play," Daniel said, glancing up with a small smile. "Go ahead." "You said your mother didn't have a stable place to stay for 2 winters, Maya said carefully. "What happened to her, if you don't mind me asking?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, running his thumb along the edge of a receipt, the kind of pause that told her this was not a story he told often, but also not one he had buried so deep it hurt to bring up. "She struggled with addiction for a long stretch of my childhood," he said finally. "It wasn't anybody's fault in particular, not really. Just a slow unraveling that started after my father left, and never quite stopped. There were good months, and there were terrible months. And during the terrible ones, we sometimes didn't have anywhere reliable to sleep. A shelter here, a relative's couch there, once even a car for almost 2 weeks straight." Maya set down the receipts, giving him her full attention the way he had given her his days earlier. "That must have been incredibly hard for a kid to go through." "It was," Daniel admitted. "But it also taught me something I don't think I could have learned any other way. It taught me that the difference between someone falling completely through the cracks and someone finding their footing again often comes down to one person, just one, who decides to treat them like they still matter. My mother eventually did get back on her feet, got clean, held down steady work for the last 8 years of her life, before she passed from causes that had nothing to do with any of that. And she always said it was a stranger who ran a laundromat of all things, who gave her that first push, letting her wash clothes for free during the worst stretch, treating her like a person instead of a problem to be avoided." "Is that why you do this?" Maya asked. "Offer a couch to strangers who show up soaked in the rain?" Daniel laughed, a genuine warm sound. "I wouldn't call it a policy. You're actually the first person I've ever offered that couch to, if I'm being honest. But I suppose somewhere in the back of my mind, I've always known that if the right person needed it at the right moment, I wasn't going to be the guy who looked the other way." Maya felt something tighten pleasantly in her chest, a feeling she did not immediately have a name for, something between gratitude and the particular kind of respect that grows for a person who has turned genuine pain into genuine kindness rather than bitterness. "Well," she said, trying to keep her voice light even as her eyes stung slightly, "for what it's worth, I'm glad I was soaked in the rain on the right night." "Me too," Daniel said simply, and went back to sorting receipts, though the silence that followed felt warmer than any silence had a right to feel. It was into this quiet, comfortable afternoon that the bell above the diner door would eventually chime again, though neither of them yet knew what that particular chime was about to bring. For now, the shoebox of receipts sat mostly sorted between them. The radio hummed low behind the counter, and outside the window the sky had cleared for the first time in days, sunlight cutting thin gold lines across the diner floor. Maya glanced toward the window absently, watching cars pass on the street outside, none of them slowing, none of them familiar, and allowed herself, just for that moment, to believe that whatever storm had chased her here had finally passed for good. She did not see the gray sedan idling at the far end of the block, its driver leaning forward slightly to read the half-burned-out letters of the diner sign, committing the address to memory before pulling away, not yet ready to walk through that door, but no longer far from it either. That night, after the last customer left and the chairs were stacked on the tables for mopping, Daniel noticed Maya lingering by the front window longer than usual, watching the empty street with an expression he could not quite place. "Everything okay?" he asked, pausing with the mop in hand. "I keep feeling like someone's watching this place," Maya admitted, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the diner. "Probably just nerves. I haven't felt truly settled in days, and I think my mind is filling in threats that aren't really there." Daniel set the mop against the counter and came to stand beside her at the window, following her gaze out into the quiet street, the streetlights humming faintly overhead, the pavement still slick from the earlier rain. "For what it's worth," he said gently. "Whatever's out there, You're not facing it from a car anymore, or a stranger's stoop. You've got a door that locks, and people who'd notice if something felt wrong. Maya managed a small smile, grateful for the reassurance, even if some quiet, stubborn part of her instinct refused to fully believe it. "Thank you," she said, "for all of this. I know I keep saying it, but I don't think you understand how much it means." "You've thanked me plenty," Daniel said. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's another day, and the eggs won't crack themselves." She laughed softly and headed toward the back office, glancing once more over her shoulder at the empty street before the door swung shut behind her. Outside, the gray sedan was gone from its earlier spot at the end of the block, but its absence brought her no comfort at all, because somewhere in the pit of her stomach, she understood that its disappearance did not mean the search for her had ended. It only meant it had paused. A full week passed before anything changed, and during that week Maya settled into a rhythm she had not expected to find so quickly. She woke early with Daniel, helped prep the diner before the morning rush, learned the names of the regulars, an elderly man named Harold who ordered the same plate of toast and eggs every single day, and always left exactly the same tip, a young mother named Priya who came in twice a week, with a toddler who threw crackers on the floor with cheerful, unrepentant enthusiasm. Maya found herself looking forward to these small, ordinary interactions, in a way she had not expected, each one a tiny thread stitching her more firmly into a life that felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely her own. She had not called her father. She had sent one more brief message, this one slightly longer than the first, telling him she was staying with a friend and working, that she needed time and space to think, that she would reach out when she was ready to talk properly. He had not responded to that one at all, which worried her more than any angry reply could have. Her father's silence had always been more dangerous than his words, a held breath before a storm she could never quite predict the shape of. On the 7th evening, after closing, Daniel found her sitting on the back steps of the diner, phone in hand, staring at nothing in particular. "You look like you're carrying something heavy," he said, sitting down beside her, close enough to offer company, far enough to respect her space. "I keep thinking about calling him," Maya admitted. "Not to go back, not to apologize for things I don't think I need to apologize for. Just to actually talk, really talk, instead of these clipped little messages that don't say anything real." "What's stopping you?" Daniel asked. "I'm afraid that the moment I hear his voice, I'll turn back into the person I was before I left," Maya said. "The one who apologized for things that weren't her fault, just to keep the peace. The one who shrank herself down to fit into whatever shape he wanted that day. I worked so hard to feel like myself again this past week, and I'm terrified that one phone call could undo all of it." Daniel considered this for a long moment before responding, the kind of careful consideration that Maya had come to associate with him specifically, a rare quality in a world where most people rush to offer advice before fully understanding the question. "I don't think growth works like that," he said finally. "You're not the same person who walked out that door a week ago, storm or no storm. You've held down work here, made your own decisions, taken care of yourself without leaning on him for a single thing. That doesn't disappear the moment you hear his voice again. If anything, I think it might be the thing that finally lets you talk to him as an equal, instead of as someone still trying to earn his approval." Maya turned this idea over in her mind, testing its weight against the fear that had kept her frozen for a week. "You really believe that?" "I believe you're stronger than you're giving yourself credit for," Daniel said simply. "But I also think there's no rule that says you have to call him tonight, or tomorrow, or on any particular schedule at all. Do it when you're ready, not before." She nodded slowly, grateful again for the way he never pushed, only offered, always leaving the final decision entirely in her hands. It struck her, sitting there in the cooling evening air, how different this felt from every relationship she had known before. How strange it was that a near stranger had become, in the space of a single week, one of the steadiest presences in her life. The following afternoon brought an unexpected complication. Maya was behind the counter, refilling napkin dispensers, when the bell above the door chimed, and a woman in her 50s walked in, familiar in a vague, unplaceable way that made Maya's stomach tighten before her mind caught up with why. It took a moment before recognition clicked fully into place. This was Diane, a longtime neighbor of her father's, someone who had lived 2 houses down for as long as Maya could remember, someone who occasionally still ran into Victor Coleman at the mailbox or the grocery store. Diane's eyes widened slightly when she spotted Maya, surprise flickering across her face, before settling into something more careful, more calculated. "Maya," she said, approaching the counter with the particular gentleness people use when they suspect they've stumbled onto something delicate. "I almost didn't recognize you. It's been a while." "Hi, Diane," Maya said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, though her hands had gone still around the napkin dispenser. "Just working here for a bit." "Your father's been beside himself," Diane said, lowering her voice as though sharing a confidence, though there was no one else nearby to overhear. "I saw him just yesterday. Looked like he hadn't slept properly in days. He didn't say much. You know how he is. But I could tell something was wrong. Is everything all right between you two?" Maya felt the careful, hard-won steadiness of the past week wobble slightly under the weight of this unexpected reminder of everything waiting for her back home. "We're working things out," she said, which was not exactly a lie, though it was not entirely the truth either. Diane studied her for a moment longer, clearly sensing there was more to the story than Maya was offering, but she did not press further, ordering a coffee to go and settling into small talk about the neighborhood instead, the kind of easy chatter that let Maya's pulse slowly return to normal. But after Diane left, coffee in hand, promising vaguely to say hello to no one in particular, Maya stood frozen behind the counter, gripping the edge so hard her knuckles went pale. Daniel appeared beside her within seconds, having watched the entire exchange from the kitchen pass through with quiet concern. "You okay?" "She knows my father," Maya said, her voice tight. "She might tell him where I am. She might already be calling him right now." "Would that be the worst thing?" Daniel asked carefully, not pushing, simply offering the question as something worth sitting with. Maya opened her mouth to answer immediately, some instinctive protest rising in her throat, and then stopped, actually considering the question instead of reacting to it. Would it be the worst thing? She thought of her father's silence over the past days, the worry Diane had described, the sleepless nights she could almost picture without needing to be told. Some old, frightened part of her still expected an explosion the moment he learned where she was, still braced for the same suffocating disappointment that had chased her out the door in the first place. But another part of her, a newer part, forged during this week of standing on her own 2 feet, wondered if she was ready to find out whether that fear still matched reality, or whether it was simply an old habit she had never gotten the chance to test. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but I think I'd rather find out on my own terms than have him show up here unannounced." That night, long after closing, Maya sat alone in the office with her phone in hand for nearly an hour, the blank text field open and empty in front of her, cursor blinking patiently, waiting. She typed several versions of a message and deleted each one, searching for words that felt honest without reopening every old wound at once. Finally, close to midnight, she settled on something simple. "I'm staying at a diner called Arts Place, on Kessler Street. I'm safe. I'd like to talk, but on my terms when I'm ready. Please don't come here unannounced." She stared at the message for a long moment before finally pressing send, her heart hammering as though she had just stepped off a ledge rather than sent a text message. The reply came faster than she expected, only 3 words long. "I understand. Thank you." It was, she thought, the gentlest response she could remember receiving from her father in years, and for one brief, hopeful moment, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps this could go better than she had feared. She did not yet understand that her father's version of understanding and his version of waiting patiently were 2 very different things, shaped by years of a mind that equated love with control so thoroughly that even his best intentions sometimes curdled into something closer to intrusion. 2 days later, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, with the diner half full of the regular lunch crowd, the bell above the door chimed one more time, and Maya, wiping down a table near the window, looked up to see a face she would have recognized anywhere, even after everything, even after the distance, and the silence, and the desperate week of trying to become someone new. Before that moment arrived, though, the 2 days between Maya's message and her father's appearance had been filled with a quiet, careful kind of hope that neither she nor Daniel had quite dared to name out loud. The morning after she sent the message, Maya moved through her shift at the diner, with a lightness Daniel noticed immediately, humming along to the radio as she refilled sugar dispensers, smiling more easily at customers than she had all week. When he asked what had changed, she told him about the message, about her father's brief but gentle reply, and for a moment, something like cautious optimism passed between them. "That's good," Daniel said, though something in his tone made Maya glance up. "I mean it. I'm glad he responded the way he did." "But?" Maya prompted, catching the hesitation underneath his words. Daniel hesitated, clearly weighing how honest to be. "I just think it's worth remembering that one calm text message doesn't undo years of a certain pattern overnight. I'm not saying he won't surprise you. People can change, and 3 days of restraint from what you've described is genuinely something. I just don't want you to build the whole reunion up so high in your head that anything less than perfect feels like a failure." Maya considered this, turning it over slowly. "You think he's going to come here anyway, don't you? Even after I asked him not to." "I think," Daniel said carefully, "that a man who drove around this neighborhood for days searching for you probably isn't the type to sit at home patiently waiting for a phone call, no matter what he promised in a text message. I hope I'm wrong." Maya did not answer right away. Some quiet, familiar part of her recognized the truth in what he was saying, even as she wished it were not true, because she knew her father, knew the particular way his anxiety curdled into action, knew that waiting had never been one of his strengths even under the best of circumstances. Still, she wanted to believe that this time might be different, that the 3 careful words he had sent her meant he was finally willing to let her set the terms of their reconciliation instead of dictating them himself. That evening, after the dinner rush thinned out, Harold, the elderly regular who ordered the same plate of toast and eggs every single day, lingered a little longer than usual at the counter, watching Maya work with the quiet, observant patience of someone who had clearly seen a great deal of life pass through diner windows over the years. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, you know," he said, when she came to refill his coffee. "I've watched a lot of young people come through this town. Some of them, they run from something, and just keep running forever, never really stopping to catch their breath. Others, they run just far enough to figure out what they actually want, and then they turn around and face it properly. You strike me as the second kind." Maya smiled, unexpectedly moved by the small, unprompted kindness. "I hope you're right, Harold." "I usually am," he said, with the particular confidence of a man who had earned the right to say so. "Course, don't tell my wife I said that. She'd have 5 examples ready before I finished the sentence." Maya laughed, grateful for the levity, grateful for the strange little found family that seemed to have gathered around her in this small diner over the course of a single week. People who had known her only days, and yet somehow understood exactly what she needed, whether that was space, or encouragement, or, in Harold's case, gentle humor at just the right moment. That night, lying on the office couch that had become surprisingly comfortable through familiarity, Maya found herself thinking not about fear, for once, but about possibility. She thought about what it might actually look like if her father showed up ready to listen rather than lecture, if the man who had spent 13 years raising her alone might finally be capable of hearing her as an adult instead of correcting her as a child. She let herself imagine, cautiously, a version of the future where she did not have to choose between having a relationship with her father and having a life of her own. She fell asleep with that fragile hope still intact, unaware that just a few miles away, her father was pacing the length of his kitchen, phone in hand, staring at the address she had given him, wrestling with a promise he had made in good faith, but was already beginning to feel he could not honor. Victor Coleman was not, by nature, a patient man. He had built his entire adult life around solving problems the moment he identified them, an instinct that had served him well in his career, in managing a household alone after his wife's death, in raising a daughter through every crisis a single father could face without a partner to share the weight. Waiting, to him, had never felt like patience. It had always felt like failure, like standing still while a problem grew larger, simply because he lacked the courage to address it directly. He told himself, that first night after her message, that he would honor her request, that he would wait for her to reach out again on her own timeline. He told himself the same thing the second night, pacing his kitchen long after midnight, replaying every argument they had ever had, searching for the exact moment things between them had gone wrong, unable to find a single point where he felt he had done anything but try to protect her. By the third day, patience had fully curdled into something closer to desperation. He told himself he was not breaking his promise. Not really. He simply needed to see her, needed to know with his own eyes that she was truly safe, that the diner she mentioned was a legitimate, secure place, and not some excuse covering a more dangerous situation. He told himself he would not push, would not lecture, would simply look, and perhaps, if the moment felt right, say a few words and leave. He believed every word of this reasoning completely, as he got into his car that Thursday afternoon and began driving toward Kessler Street, unaware that his own daughter, 3 miles away, had just finished humming along to the radio while refilling sugar dispensers, feeling, for the first time in over a week, something close to genuine peace. Her father stood in the doorway of the diner, and despite his brief promise of patience, despite 3 days of restraint that had clearly cost him everything he had come anyway. For a moment, neither of them moved. The diner around them continued its quiet lunchtime hum, forks against plates, the low murmur of conversation, the radio playing something soft behind the counter, entirely oblivious to the fact that the room had just shifted beneath Maya's feet. Victor stood just inside the doorway, hands at his sides, his eyes fixed on his daughter with an expression that mixed relief and something harder to name, something that looked almost like fear dressed up as certainty. "Maya," he said, and his voice, even across the distance of the room, carried the particular weight it always had, the kind of voice that filled a space whether it meant to or not. Maya set down the rag she had been using to wipe the table, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the nearby customers could hear it. "You said you'd wait," she said, and though she tried to keep her voice steady, it came out thinner than she intended, caught somewhere between anger and the small, traitorous relief of simply seeing his face again. "I know what I said," Victor replied, taking a step further into the diner, glancing around the room with an expression that seemed to be cataloging every detail, the worn booths, the regulars watching with poorly disguised curiosity, the man behind the counter who had gone very still, watching him with careful, measured attention. "I couldn't just sit at home anymore, Maya. 3 days of not knowing exactly where you were, exactly who you were with. It was more than I could take." Daniel emerged from behind the counter at that moment, moving with the unhurried calm of someone who had spent years managing difficult moments in a public space, positioning himself near enough to be present without inserting himself directly between father and daughter. "Can I get you a coffee, sir?" he asked, his tone even, deliberately ordinary, an attempt to lower the temperature of a room that had grown suddenly very warm. Victor's eyes shifted to Daniel, taking him in fully for the first time, and something in his expression hardened. "Who are you?" he said, and it was not quite a question, more an accusation waiting for a target. "You're the one she's been staying with." "Dad," Maya said sharply, stepping forward, placing herself slightly between the two men, without fully realizing she had done it. "This is Daniel. He owns this diner. He gave me somewhere safe to stay when I had nowhere else to go, and he's asked for absolutely nothing in return the entire time." "A grown man letting a young woman he doesn't know sleep in his back office," Victor said, his voice tightening, the careful restraint of the past 3 days visibly fraying at the edges. "Forgive me if that doesn't exactly put my mind at ease." "It's not what you're imagining," Maya said, feeling heat rise in her own chest now, old frustration mixing with new protectiveness. "He didn't do anything except treat me with basic decency, which is more than I can say for how you've been treating me for years." The words landed harder than she intended, and she watched something flicker across her father's face, a mixture of hurt and defensiveness that she recognized instantly from 100 old arguments. "I have spent my entire life protecting you," Victor said, his voice rising slightly despite himself, though he seemed to catch it, pulling it back down with visible effort. "Everything I have ever done, every rule, every hard conversation, it was because I could not bear the thought of something happening to you, the way it happened to your mother, gone before either of us had any warning at all. You think that makes me the villain in this story. I don't think you're a villain," Maya said, her voice cracking slightly, all the careful steadiness she had built over the past week, suddenly feeling fragile under the weight of his presence. "I think you're my father, and I think you love me, and I also think loving me and controlling me became the same thing to you a long time ago, and I needed space to figure out where one ended and the other began." The diner had gone almost entirely silent now, the regulars pretending, with varying degrees of success, to be absorbed in their meals rather than the unfolding scene near the window booth. Daniel remained close but quiet, his presence steady without being intrusive, ready to step in only if the moment required it, trusting Maya to hold her own ground in a conversation that was, ultimately, hers to have. Victor's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it looked as though he might push back harder, might slide into the same tone that had chased her out the door in the first place. But something in him seemed to catch, some flicker of awareness breaking through years of habit, and instead of arguing further, he simply stood there, visibly struggling with the effort of holding himself back from the reaction that came most naturally to him. "I drove around this neighborhood for 3 nights straight," he said finally, quieter now, some of the hardness draining out of his voice. "I didn't sleep more than a few hours total. I kept picturing the worst things a father can picture, and I couldn't make them stop, no matter how much I told myself you were smart enough to be safe. I know that's not an excuse for showing up here after promising I wouldn't. I know I broke that promise within 3 days, but I need you to understand, Maya. The fear I have felt this past week has been unlike anything since the day your mother died." Maya felt something in her chest crack slightly at this admission, the raw honesty in it catching her off guard, so different from the controlled, corrective tone she had expected walking in. "I understand the fear," she said carefully. "I do. But Dad, you can't keep showing up in my life like this, showing up wherever I try to build something on my own, treating every choice I make as a crisis that requires you to take over. That's not protection anymore. That's not trusting me to survive without you managing every part of my life." Victor was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from his daughter to Daniel, then around the diner, taking in the small, ordinary life she had begun building here in less than 2 weeks, a life that had apparently required none of the control he had spent years believing was essential to her safety. Something in his expression shifted, slow and uncertain, like a man recalculating a math problem he had been certain he understood correctly for years. "I don't know how to do this any other way," he admitted finally, and the honesty of the confession seemed to cost him more than any argument could have. "I don't know how to love you without trying to control every outcome. I've never known any other way. Your mother used to tell me the same thing, near the end, that I needed to learn to let things happen without trying to manage every piece of them. I never learned it. I'm not sure I know how to start now." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded in a way Maya had never heard from her father before, not once in 19 years. She felt tears sting at the corners of her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome in a public diner full of curious onlookers, but she let them come anyway, too tired to keep holding everything so carefully contained. "Then maybe," she said quietly, "we both need to learn something new. You need to learn how to let me go far enough to trust me, and I need to learn how to let you back in, without feeling like I'm losing myself all over again." Victor looked at her for a long moment, something in his face softening in a way she had not seen since before her mother's death, when he had still believed, perhaps, that gentleness and strength could coexist rather than compete with each other. "Can we sit?" he asked, glancing toward the empty booth near the window. "And talk properly?" "Not here, standing in the middle of a business you're trying to work in. Properly, if you'll let me." Maya glanced at Daniel, an unspoken question passing between them, and he gave her the smallest nod, a silent reassurance that he was right there if she needed him, that the choice was entirely hers to make. She turned back to her father, and, after a long breath, nodded. "Okay," she said. "We can talk, but Dad, I need you to actually listen this time. Not wait for your turn to explain why you were right. Actually listen." Victor nodded, slower and more deliberate than she had ever seen him agree to anything. "I'll try," he said. "That's the most honest promise I can make you right now." They sat together in the window booth, father and daughter, the afternoon light slanting gold across the table between them, while behind the counter, Daniel busied himself with tasks that did not strictly need doing, giving them privacy, while remaining close enough that Maya would never once feel unwatched or unsafe in her own space. The conversation that followed was not a magic fix, not a tidy resolution wrapped up in a single afternoon, but it was, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, an honest one. 2 hours later, when Victor finally stood to leave, his eyes were red-rimmed in a way that suggested he had cried at some point during their conversation, something Maya could not remember witnessing even once in her entire childhood. He paused at the door, glancing back toward Daniel, who was refilling a napkin dispenser nearby, and for a moment, something passed between the two men that was not quite friendship, but was no longer outright hostility either. "Thank you," Victor said, the words visibly difficult for him, for looking after her when I couldn't. She looked after herself, Daniel said simply. I just made sure she had somewhere dry to do it from. Victor nodded once, something like respect settling into his expression, and then he was gone, the bell above the door chiming softly behind him, leaving Maya standing in the middle of the diner with her heart feeling, for the first time in weeks, something closer to whole than broken. During those 2 hours in the window booth, the conversation had moved through more territory than either of them expected, weaving between old grievances and unexpected tenderness in a way that left both of them emotionally raw by the time it ended. At one point, Victor had reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, worn soft at the edges from years of handling, and slid it across the table toward her. It was a picture of Maya's mother, laughing at something outside the frame, taken not long before the diagnosis that would eventually take her life. I carry this everywhere, Victor admitted, his voice thick. Every single day since she died, I used to think if I just held on tightly enough to everything else, to you, to the house, to every decision that touched your life, I could somehow keep from losing anything else, the way I lost her. I know now that isn't how any of this works, but knowing it and actually living differently, those turned out to be two very separate things. Maya turned the photograph over in her hands, studying her mother's face, a face she remembered only in fragments, more feeling than detail, after 13 years without her. I never knew you carried this, she said softly. There's a lot you don't know, Victor said, because I never let you see the parts of me that felt weak. I thought fathers were supposed to be certain, supposed to have all the answers. I didn't realize that pretending to have all the answers was its own kind of lie, one that eventually pushed you further away than any honest uncertainty ever could have. They talked, too, about the boyfriend Maya had broken things off with months earlier, the one whose dinners with her father had felt like interrogations. Victor admitted, with visible difficulty, that his suspicion of the young man had come less from any real concern about his character, and more from a general, formless fear of any person who might eventually take Maya somewhere Victor could not easily follow. That wasn't fair to either of us, Maya said. Not to him, and not to me. I ended things with him partly because I couldn't take the tension anymore, and I've spent months wondering if that was even really my choice, or if it was just easier than fighting you on one more thing. Victor absorbed this in silence for a long moment, his expression pained. I am sorry for that, he said finally, the words clearly costing him something significant to say aloud. I don't know if sorry is enough, after years of decisions I made on your behalf that were never really mine to make. But I am sorry, and I mean it as more than just a word to get through this conversation. Maya felt the sincerity in his voice, unfamiliar as it was, and allowed herself to believe it, cautiously, the way you test ice before trusting your full weight to it. I don't need you to fix everything today, she said. I just need to know you're willing to actually try, not just say the right things in this one conversation, and then go back to how things were once the fear wears off. I don't know exactly how to prove that to you in a single afternoon, Victor admitted. But I am willing to see someone, a counselor, if that would help. I am willing to have more conversations like this one, even when they're uncomfortable. I don't want to lose you the way I lost her. I would rather learn to let go a little, than lose you completely by holding on too hard. It was, Maya thought, the most self-aware thing she had ever heard her father say, and though she knew one conversation could not undo 2 decades of pattern in an afternoon, she felt something loosen in her chest all the same, a tightness she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. Near the end of their conversation, Harold, who had been lingering over a second cup of coffee far longer than his usual visit required, caught Maya's eye from across the diner and gave her a small, knowing nod, the kind of gesture that said, without words, that he had seen enough of the world to recognize the shape of something healing when it happened in front of him. When Victor finally rose to leave, he hesitated by the booth for a moment, looking at his daughter with an expression she had rarely seen on his face, something unguarded and a little uncertain, the look of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about strength. But the story was not finished yet, and both Maya and her father still had a great deal of difficult, careful work ahead of them, before anything resembling real healing could take root. 3 weeks later, Maya sat in a small counseling office with pale green walls and a window that looked out over a quiet parking lot, her father beside her, both of them a little stiff in the unfamiliar plastic chairs. It had taken 2 calls and a fair amount of hesitation on Victor's part before he actually followed through on his promise to seek help. But here he was, notebook in hand, looking more nervous than Maya had ever seen him look in any boardroom or negotiation throughout her entire childhood. The counselor, a calm woman named Priyanka Rao, with an easy, unhurried manner, had spent the first session mostly listening, letting both of them lay out their history without interruption, occasionally asking a gentle question to draw out something neither of them had quite said out loud before. It was strange, Maya thought, hearing her father describe his own childhood for the first time, a strict household of his own growing up, a father who believed love and discipline were interchangeable concepts, a pattern Victor had absorbed so completely he had never questioned whether it was the only way to raise a child who felt truly safe. I am not asking you to excuse the way I behaved, Victor said during that second session, addressing Maya directly rather than the counselor, something he had been gently encouraged to practice. I am only trying to explain where it came from, so that maybe you can understand. It was never really about doubting you. It was about a fear I never learned how to separate from control. Maya listened, feeling the old resentment inside her shift slightly, not disappearing entirely. Understanding did not work quite that simply, but softening at the edges into something she could hold without it consuming every other feeling she had toward him. Outside of those sessions, life at the diner continued in its steady, comforting rhythm. Maya had, by then, moved into a small studio apartment 2 blocks from Daniel's diner, paid for with money she had genuinely earned working real shifts, the arrangement having shifted naturally from charity into something closer to an actual job once she proved, again and again, how capable she was. She still came by most mornings before her shift began elsewhere, part-time work at a local bookstore she had found through one of the regulars, but the diner remained something like home base, the place where everything had first begun to change. Daniel had become, in the weeks since her father's visit, something she found herself thinking about more often than she quite wanted to admit. There was an ease between them now that had grown slowly, built out of shared mornings and long conversations during slow afternoons, out of the particular intimacy that comes from someone seeing you at your most frightened and choosing, again and again, to treat you with nothing but steady kindness. "You've been quiet today," Daniel observed one afternoon, several weeks after the counseling sessions had begun, as they sat together during the lull between lunch and dinner, sorting through inventory lists that neither of them was actually paying much attention to. "Just thinking," Maya said, "about how different my life looks now compared to 2 months ago. I was terrified that night, running through the rain, half convinced I'd made the worst decision of my life leaving home with nothing but a backpack. And now, somehow, I have an apartment, a job I actually chose for myself, a father who's genuinely trying to change, instead of just performing change for a single afternoon, before going back to old patterns. It doesn't feel entirely real yet." "It's real," Daniel said. "You built all of it yourself. I just happened to have an empty couch on the right night." Maya smiled, shaking her head slightly. "You keep saying that, like the couch is the whole story. It wasn't just the couch, Daniel. It was you deciding to actually see me instead of looking the other way. Most people would have handed a stranger a cup of coffee and considered their good deed finished for the night. You kept showing up, every single day, in ways that had nothing to do with obligation." Daniel was quiet for a moment, setting down the inventory list entirely now, giving her his full attention in the way she had come to associate specifically with him, a rare quality of presence that made her feel, every single time, like the only thing in the room worth paying attention to. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "I think I knew, that very first night, watching you sit in that booth, trying so hard to convince me and yourself that you were fine, that I wasn't going to just let you disappear back into the rain once you finished your coffee. I don't fully understand why, not in any way I can explain cleanly. I just knew." Something warm settled in Maya's chest at this admission, an honesty that matched, in its own quiet way, the honesty her father had finally begun offering her during their counseling sessions, proof that the people worth keeping close were the ones willing to be genuinely seen, rather than simply admired from a comfortable distance. 2 months after that rainy night, Victor Coleman organized a small dinner at his house, the first time Maya had returned to her childhood home since walking out the door in anger. It was not a grand gesture, no elaborate speech, no dramatic display of transformation. It was simply a homemade meal, the two of them sitting at the same table where they had shared thousands of ordinary dinners throughout her childhood, talking with an openness that would have felt impossible only weeks earlier. At Maya's request, Daniel joined them for dessert, arriving a little after the main course had finished, carrying a pie from the diner as an offering, something familiar and homemade to bridge the awkwardness of the occasion. Victor greeted him at the door with a handshake that, while still a little formal, carried none of the suspicion of their first meeting. "Thank you for coming," Victor said, stepping aside to let him in. "And for the pie. I hear it's quite good." "Best in the neighborhood," Daniel said with a small smile, "though I might be a little biased, seeing as I made it." The three of them sat together in the small dining room for the rest of the evening, conversation flowing more easily than Maya could have imagined possible only a few months earlier, her father asking Daniel genuine questions about the diner, about his mother, about the life he had built out of difficult beginnings, listening with an attentiveness that felt entirely new, a father finally learning how to be curious about the world beyond his own fears, instead of trying to control every corner of it. Later that night, walking Daniel back toward his car parked on the quiet street outside her father's house, Maya paused beneath the porch light, the same kind of gentle glow that had first drawn her toward his diner months earlier during that terrible soaking storm. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight. For all of it, really. I don't think I would have found my way back to him without you showing me first what it actually felt like to be treated with basic decency, no strings attached." "You would have found your way eventually," Daniel said. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. I've said that before, and I still believe it completely." "Maybe," Maya said, "but I'm glad I didn't have to find it alone." Daniel looked at her for a long moment under the soft porch light, something unspoken passing between them that felt, finally, ready to be spoken aloud. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad too. Glad you walked into my diner that night. Glad you kept coming back. Glad I get to keep showing up, if you'll let me." Maya smiled, the kind of smile that came easily now, unburdened by the fear and exhaustion that had defined so much of her life only a few short months earlier. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that a lot." In the months that followed, Maya's relationship with her father continued to grow steadier. Not perfect, never entirely free of old habits resurfacing occasionally in small, forgivable ways, but genuinely different, built now on actual conversation rather than silent compliance. Victor continued attending counseling long after the sessions were strictly necessary, determined, in his own quiet way, to become the kind of father who could love his daughter without needing to control every outcome of her life. And Maya, for her part, learned something she had not expected to learn on that terrible, rain-soaked night when she first pushed open the door of a nearly empty diner with nothing but a soaked backpack and $23 to her name. That safety was not something you had to fight your way toward alone. That sometimes the smallest, quietest acts of kindness, a cup of coffee offered without expectation, a couch made available without conditions, a door left unlocked so she never had to feel trapped, were exactly what a person needed to find their footing again, after everything around them had fallen apart. She kept, tucked into her wallet, a small folded receipt from that very first night, the coffee Daniel had refused to let her pay for, a tiny, ordinary artifact of the evening that had quietly changed the entire direction of her life. It was not much to look at, faded ink on thin paper, but to Maya, it represented something far larger than the $2 it had once been worth. Proof that even on the worst night of her life, kindness had been waiting for her, patient and unassuming, in the last place she expected to find it. 6 months after that rainy night, on a quiet weekday morning with pale sunlight spilling through the diner windows, Maya arrived early, as she often did now, letting herself in through the back door with a key Daniel had given her weeks earlier. One small, ordinary gesture that had meant more to her than she knew how to properly explain. She found him already at the grill, humming along to the same worn-out radio station that had played softly in the background of nearly every important conversation of the past half-year. "You're early," he said, glancing up with the easy smile that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. "Couldn't sleep," Maya said, tying an apron around her waist out of habit rather than necessity, since she no longer technically worked mornings, having moved into managing the bookstore's daytime shifts weeks earlier. She simply liked being here, in this particular kitchen, at this particular hour, more than she liked being anywhere else. Figured I'd come annoy you instead. Best offer I've had all week, Daniel said, sliding a mug of coffee across the counter toward her without being asked. The same easy, unconditional gesture that had first cracked open something guarded inside her, all those months ago. She took the coffee and settled onto her usual stool, watching him work with the quiet, comfortable familiarity of two people who had built an entire relationship out of small, unremarkable mornings just like this one. Outside, Kessler Street was waking up slowly, delivery trucks rumbling past, the first regulars beginning to trickle in for their usual orders, Harold among them, already settling into his booth with the newspaper tucked under one arm, ready for his daily plate of toast and eggs. Her father called later that same afternoon, a habit he had kept faithfully for months now, checking in not out of anxious need to control her whereabouts, but simply because he had learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to want to know about her life, without needing to manage every piece of it. He told her about a project at work, asked about the bookstore, asked, almost shyly, whether she and Daniel had any plans for the weekend, a question that would have felt impossibly invasive coming from him a year earlier, and now simply felt like a father showing genuine interest in his daughter's life. "We're thinking about visiting the coast," Maya told him. "Nothing fancy, just a day trip." "That sounds nice," Victor said, and she could hear, even through the phone, the genuine warmth behind the simple words, so different from the careful, measuring tone that had defined so much of her childhood. "Send me a picture if you remember. I'd like to see it." "I will," Maya said, and meant it, surprised at how easily the promise came now, how little it cost her to offer him this small window into her life, without fearing it would become another opportunity for judgment or control. After she hung up, she sat for a long moment on the back steps of the diner, the same steps where she had once sat with Daniel a week into her stay, uncertain and afraid, wondering whether reaching out to her father was even worth the risk. She thought about how far both of them had traveled since then, not in miles, but in the quiet, difficult work of learning to see each other clearly, without the distortions of fear or old habit clouding the view. The diner door swung open behind her, and Daniel stepped out to join her on the steps, 2 slices of pie balanced carefully in his hands, the same recipe he had brought to her father's house months earlier, now simply a Tuesday afternoon habit between them, rather than a special occasion offering. "Your dad again?" he asked, settling down beside her, handing over one of the plates. "Checking in," Maya said. "Asked about the coast trip, wants pictures." "Progress," Daniel said, and there was no sarcasm in the word, only genuine warmth, the kind of quiet approval that came from someone who had watched the entire journey unfold, one small step at a time, and understood exactly how much each of those steps had cost. Maya leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the late afternoon light stretch long shadows across the small parking lot behind the diner, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, entirely and completely at peace. The storm that had once chased her through unfamiliar streets, headlights crawling along the curb, fear knotting tight in her chest, felt now like something that had happened to an entirely different person, someone she remembered with compassion rather than dread. She thought sometimes about that first night, about the particular sound of the bell above the diner door, about the plain, uncomplicated kindness of a stranger who had simply offered her a warm cup of coffee and a dry place to sleep, expecting absolutely nothing in return. It had seemed, at the time, like such a small thing, barely worth mentioning against the scale of everything else that had gone wrong that night. But small things, she had come to understand, were very often the hinge on which entire lives turned. Quiet, unremarkable moments of decency that mattered more than anyone involved could possibly have known in the moment they happened. The sun continued its slow descent behind the rooftops of Kessler Street, and inside the diner, the evening rush was just beginning to stir, chairs scraping against tile, the bell above the door chiming its familiar welcome to another round of tired, hungry strangers looking for nothing more than a warm meal and a place to sit for a little while. Maya finished her pie, set the plate aside, and stood, ready to help close out the day the way she had helped open so many others since that very first storm-swept rainy night, when a stranger had offered her a safe place to sleep, and everything in her life had slowly, steadily, begun to change for the better.